October 1971. A man named Terence McKenna is in the Colombian Amazon in a place called La Carrera with his brother Dennis and a handful of friends who have followed him there looking for a vine called ukuhey. They don't find the vine. What they find instead is a pasture full of cattle, and on top of those cattle pies, more Stropharia cubensis mushrooms than any of them have ever seen in one place. Big ones, blue bruising at the stem, growing in obscene quantity in the wet heat. Terence is 24 years old. He has read everything. He has theories about everything. And over the next 2 weeks, in a thatched hut at the edge of that pasture, he and his brother are going to eat those mushrooms, a lot of those mushrooms, and they are going to come back to the United States convinced of something that 20 years later, Terence will say out loud at a conference in Palm Springs. He's going to say that the reason your brain is the size it is, the reason you can do math, write a sonnet, lie to your boss, fall in love with a stranger, is because somewhere between 2 million and 700,000 years ago, a hominid in East Africa ate one of those mushrooms off a pile of antelope dung. That's the claim. That's tonight. But to understand why that idea got traction, and why it still won't go away, even after most of the scientific establishment has waved it off, we have to back up. Because the Stoned Ape Theory isn't really one theory. It's two men, 30 years apart, looking at the same mushroom and seeing the same impossible thing. Terence McKenna grew up in a small town in western Colorado, Paonia, hunted fossils as a kid, read Jung at 14, got into Berkeley in the late 60s, which is the exact right place at the exact right time if your interest is altered states of consciousness. By the time he gets to La Carrera in 71, he's already tried most of what Berkeley has to offer, and he's hungry for the thing the books keep pointing at, the original sacrament, the one the shamans actually used. He comes back from the Amazon a different person, spends the 70s cultivating mushrooms with his brother. They wrote the first English language manual on how to grow Stropharia cubensis at home under a pen name, and that book is genuinely part of why psilocybin spread the way it did in the 80s. But Terence isn't really a botanist. Terence is a talker. By the mid-80s, he's on the lecture circuit, and what he's lecturing about more and more is this idea he calls the stoned ape. Here's the argument, in his own framing. Roughly 2 million years ago, the climate in Africa changed. The forests our ancestors had been living in started to thin out into grassland, savanna. The hominids that had been swinging through trees and eating fruit had to come down and figure out a new way to eat. They became scavengers. They followed herds of grazing animals across the plains. And what grows on the dung of grazing animals in tropical and subtropical climates in extraordinary abundance? Psilocybe cubensis. The mushroom is what botanists call coprophilic. It loves manure. Where the cows are, the mushrooms are. Where the antelope and the buffalo are, the mushrooms are. So picture an early hominid, Homo habilis, maybe early erectus, wandering across the savanna behind a herd, hungry, trying everything, putting things in his mouth that he's not sure about. And one day, he tries the little brown thing growing out of the pile, and something happens to him that has not happened to any creature on earth before. McKenna's argument has 3 parts, and you have to take them one at a time. Part 1. At low doses, psilocybin sharpens visual acuity. There's actual research on this, Small studies contested, but it's not made up. McKenna says an animal whose vision gets sharper while hunting is going to catch more game. That animal eats better, mates more, has more children. The mushroom becomes an evolutionary advantage. Part 2. At slightly higher doses, psilocybin acts as what he called a sexual stimulant. Increased arousal, increased energy. More mating, more offspring, more selection pressure for whoever is eating the mushrooms. Part 3, and this is where he goes from speculative to wild. At higher doses still, you get the full visionary experience, synesthesia, ego dissolution. The thing where language feels like it's being invented in real time inside your skull. McKenna believed that this experience, repeated across thousands of generations, is what bootstrapped human consciousness. That the mushroom didn't just sharpen our vision, it cracked open our minds. It gave us symbol, gave us language, gave us religion, gave us art. He called the mushroom an exopheromone, a chemical messenger between species. He thought it had effectively domesticated us, the way we later domesticated wheat and dogs and ourselves. That's the theory. Big, clean, almost too clean. The kind of idea that sounds true at 3 in the morning and looks shakier at noon. Most anthropologists, when they bothered to respond at all, said the same things. The timeline doesn't work. Brain expansion in our ancestors started before grazing herds were on the savanna. The dosing claims aren't well supported. Psilocybe cubensis probably wasn't even in Africa in the relevant period. The mushroom may have come over later with the cattle the Europeans brought. There's no archaeological evidence, no mushroom residue on tools, no cave paintings of fungi from the right period. The academic verdict by the time Terence died of brain cancer in the year 2000 was something close to charming. Unprovable? No. And that should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The mushroom didn't make us human, but the question of what did is still open, and McKenna had the nerve to ask it out loud. Now here's where the story gets a second act, and it gets one because of a man named Paul Stamets. Stamets is not Terence McKenna. Stamets is a mycologist. He has patents, over a dozen of them, in antiviral compounds derived from fungi. He has worked with the Department of Defense on bioterror countermeasures. He has discovered new species. When he speaks at a conference, the people in the front row are taking notes, not tripping. In 2017, at a conference called Psychedelic Science, Stamets gets up in front of a room of researchers and clinicians, and he does something nobody expected. He defends Terence McKenna's Stoned Ape Theory. Not all of it, not the whale parts, but the core of it, the idea that psilocybin played some role in the cognitive leap that made us us. He says, on the record, this is worth taking seriously. His argument is sharper than McKenna's. He doesn't lean on the dosing speculation. He leans on what's actually been published in the last decade about what psilocybin does to a brain. What it does is this. It disrupts something called the default mode network. The default mode network is the part of your brain that runs when you're not focused on anything. When you're daydreaming, planning, replaying a conversation, building a sense of self. Psilocybin quiets that network and dramatically increases communication between brain regions that don't normally talk to each other. Imagine a city where the buses only run on 6 routes. Now imagine somebody, for 6 hours, opens up every street to every bus. New connections, new combinations. Some of those new roots turn out to be useful, and some don't. But the brain remembers the ones that worked. That's what neuroscientists are seeing in fMRI scans of people on psilocybin, and Stamets' argument is, if you give this experience to an animal that already has the cognitive hardware for symbol and language but hasn't yet figured out how to use it, you might just trigger the leap. McKenna thought the mushroom was the cause. Stamets thinks it might have been the key. Neither man is certain, and that's the part I respect about both of them. Two stories are getting told at the same time here, and they don't quite agree. The first is the one Stamets tells, rigorous, careful, grounded in modern neuroscience. The second is the one McKenna told, grand, mythic, full of things that can't be proved. They point in the same direction. They are not the same story. What's documented is this. Psilocybin demonstrably increases neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new connections, in mammals. That's been shown in mice, in rats, and in human imaging. Psilocybin, in clinical trials at Johns Hopkins and Imperial College London, has produced lasting changes in personality and cognition after a single supervised dose. The compound is being seriously studied right now as a treatment for depression, for end-of-life anxiety, for addiction. The FDA has designated it a breakthrough therapy. That's the part I can verify. That part is real, and it's happening in laboratories with IRB approval and peer review. What's not documented, what nobody has ever documented, and probably nobody ever can, is whether any of this happened to our ancestors 2 million years ago. We don't have their brains. We don't have their mushrooms. We have skulls and stone tools and a few teeth. And from that you can guess at diet, but you cannot guess at what they were tripping on. The Stoned Ape Theory, in its strongest form, will probably never be proved or disproved. It'll sit there forever in the category of ideas that explain too much and prove too little. But what I think Stamets is really arguing for isn't the academic case about whether mushrooms specifically made Homo sapiens. He's trying to get people to take seriously the idea that consciousness, yours, mine, the whole strange experience of being a mind aware of itself, might have a chemical history, that what we are might not be inevitable, that a molecule we now classify as a Schedule I controlled substance might be more woven into our species than the people writing the laws have any idea about. That's a quieter argument than McKenna's. It's also a harder one to dismiss. There's one more piece I want to leave you with, because I think it's the part that actually matters. When you look at the history of human spirituality, every religion, every shamanic tradition, every mystery cult, there's a remarkable consistency in what people on the inside report. The experience of dissolving into something larger, the sense that the self is a costume, not a person, the conviction that everything is connected, and that this is somehow the most important thing anyone could ever know. You can get there through 40 years of meditation. You can get there through fasting in a desert. You can get there through grief or near death, or standing at the ocean long enough that you forget you have a name. You can also get there in about 40 minutes with the right mushroom. The Stoned Ape Theory, whether or not it's literally true about our evolutionary past, points at something that is true about our present. There's a door in the human mind. People have been walking through it for as long as there have been people. And the chemistry of one specific fungus happens to fit the lock. McKenna thought the mushroom built the door. Stamets thinks the mushroom found the door. The truth is probably weirder than either of them, and we may never know it. Terence didn't find God in the Amazon. He found out what was already there. That's tonight's Rabbit Hour. If this is the kind of thing you want me digging into, hit subscribe. I'm back tomorrow with the strange true story of the CIA chemist who dosed an entire French village with LSD. Or did he? Good night.